Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of Smoke and Spirits. I am your host, Dominic, and tonight we delve back into the heady, the complex, but the ever-delightful world of Ushkabeha. And what is Ushkabeha? Why am I using that term now? Some of you may be familiar with it already. Ushkabeha is the Scots Gaelic translation of aquavitae. Aquavitae is a Latin term meaning water of life. The reason why I'm using this term that is associated with medieval monks will become apparent when we start looking at our latest bottle this evening. But suffice it to say that in medieval times, monks would refer to most strong spirits as aquavitae, or water of life. And for us, who are strong aficionados of whiskey of all stripes, Scotch whiskey in particular, it's with a sly sense of humor that we refer to Scotch as Ushkabeha, or water of life, because for us, it's a world without Scotch might be imagined as being slightly more bleak. Not that I want to imply that anybody watching this has dependency issues, God forbid, but certainly a good Scotch can inject an element of beauty into our lives, and we enjoy it with all of our senses, as I mentioned in previous episodes. Now, the reason why I'm using a term that was coined by medieval monks refers directly to the whiskey that we're going to look at tonight, specifically Kilchoman Machir Bay. The name Kilchoman actually means St. Coman's Church in Scots Gaelic. And the distillery itself, as well as the village for which it's named, lies on the west coast of Islay, a little bit further inland than most of the other distilleries that we had looked at. We looked at Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Lefroy. And Kilchoman, by contrast, is a little bit further inland. Machir Bay, of course, is the bay that the village overlooks from atop the sandy dunes upon which it sits. And as the name implies, St. Coman's Church was a real place in the 14th century, I believe. A small chapel that was built there for the benefit of the villagers that lived around it. As time wore on, the chapel itself fell apart and a new church was rebuilt pretty much atop the old foundations in the 1800s. That church was slightly larger as it was meant to service a larger population of villagers that had moved in. But over time, those people left or otherwise moved away, and the parish church fell into disrepair, which is pretty much its current state today. But there are still some strong reminders of its roots in medieval times, most notable of which is the Kilchoman cross, a piece of art that does date back to the 14th century as well. So I thought it would be interesting and neat to sort of link that term that's associated with the monks of the medieval ages with the ancient roots of the place of Kilchoman itself. Now, the distillery, by contrast, and this is quite a drastic contrast, but the Kilchoman distillery is actually the new kid on the block when it comes to all of the Islay distilleries. Kilchoman has only been around since 2005, and prior to that, there had not been a distillery opened for over 124 years on Islay. So they are definitely the new kid on the block, and they bring with them a very strong sense of identity. And Kilchoman is actually one of the few remaining independent distilleries in Scotland. By that I mean, when we had talked in previous episodes about the larger companies under which a lot of distilleries fall, so Diageo is kind of one of the big ones that we know about. Kilchoman pays no such allegiance to any larger group or organization. They stand on their own. So they're one of the few remaining independent distilleries in Scotland. But their uniqueness and their individuality doesn't end there. And if it sounds like I'm waxing poetic about this, it's because I really love their whiskey. And in particular, I love the Machir Bay expression of Kilchoman. But when I say that their individuality and their uniqueness doesn't end with their independence, it's because Kilchoman is a farm distillery. And if you sort of take a moment to think about it, it'll become fairly obvious what a farm distillery is. In older times, a farm distillery was a farm that pretty much fell into the business of distilling as a way of cutting down waste. So they would have leftover grain or leftover materials that they could use to ferment and distill alcohol from. So this was kind of a way to make sure that nothing was wasted and to maximize the potential of their farm. Nowadays it has a slightly different meaning, and with Kilchoman in particular, it means that everything is pretty much done on site, including the barley that they use. They use all of the barley that they use in the production of their whiskey is grown on site at the Kilchoman distillery, and every step of the production process is completed on site as well. So they are 100% independent. They are a farm distillery, meaning that they grow all their barley on site and they use the very same barley to make their whiskey, and everything's just done right there. Now, if I remember correctly, I believe that some of their malting is still done at the Port Ellen maltings, but as I say that, I feel like I'm wrong about that. Fairly certain, 95% certain, that everything is done on site for Kilchoman, as it is a point of pride with them. Now, the thing with farm distilleries is, like I said, a long time ago, farmers would sort of use that as a way to get something out of stuff that would otherwise be scraps. But one of the problems that they ran into was it's really hard to have an inland distillery unless you're close to a body of water. So I'm not suggesting that distilleries that are on the coast will use salt water from the sea to make their scotch. That's actually not true at all. But you do have to be near a body of water. So a lot of the times in the old days, when somebody tried to set up a distillery, if they hadn't planned properly to be close enough to a body of water, there was a very good chance that their distillery would fail, that their product would be so small as to be fairly insignificant. But that's not the case with Kilchoman. They've enjoyed quite a degree of success. They've only been around since 2005, and a lot of their expressions are fairly young in age statements as well. And you'd be hard-pressed to find one that has an age statement explicitly stated on their label. And as I'm fond of repeating, an age statement isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all in this modern day when we talk about some of our favorite whiskeys. But without further ado, like I said, I'm going to introduce you to Kilchoman Machir Bay. And as I mentioned earlier, if it sounds like I'm waxing poetic about this, it's because I really, really love the Kilchoman Machir Bay. And I'm going to be very honest, when I decided to try it, and this was probably 3 years ago or so when I first tried Machir Bay, it was the only Kilchoman expression that I could find at my local shop, and I decided to give it a try. Back then, I was very much an adherent of the age statement philosophy. So the fact that there wasn't one that was explicitly stated on this kind of left me a little bit cold, but that soon changed. I did a 180-degree turn on that one when I tasted this dram. And it's just a great whiskey, and they've done a tremendous job with it. We're going to look at another one of their expressions in the next episode, but for now we're going to get into the Machir Bay. And what I had started to say before I got sidetracked is that this is in my top 3. So last episode, I think I talked about my top 3. The Lefroy Quarter Cask is my absolute #1 favorite, but this one is in my top 3. Absolutely it is. And as always, I think it's funny that my subconscious sort of takes over, and I have a tendency to pour large drams when it comes to the scotches I love. which isn't to say I don't love every single one that I've featured on this show. But as I've mentioned, this one is definitely one of my favorites for sure. So I'm going to give it a little bit of water, absolutely. And why is that? It's because this one clocks in at 46% alcohol by volume. And it's not the most powerful, it's the wrong word to use, but it's not the most potent, again, the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean. It's not the most alcoholic one out there, but it certainly packs quite a punch. It packs some power and some potency in its complexity. And again, I overuse that word quite a bit, but sometimes there's no other word that actually fits. Now, if we look at the color, this is a very, very pale gold, and it doesn't have much in the way of those ruddy tones that we had seen in the other whiskeys that we had examined. This one is pale. It's almost like a lemon yellow gold. It doesn't have the warmth that a ruddy tone would bring. Almost like, I would say it's probably like a golden sun on an autumn morning. And it's certainly very refreshing. So as I'm nosing this, there's nothing that jumps out at me in a really strong way. Like, it's not very aggressive. In fact, this whiskey is probably a little bit more on the delicate side. So when we talk about single malt Scotch from Islay, of course, I keep sort of reiterating the same point that everybody seems to think that these are very dark and bold and heavy whiskeys, and certainly many of them are. This one is more delicate. So this one has a little bit more layering to it when you get down through the nosing, because it starts with salt air and brine, but then it gets down into a little bit of citrus, a little bit of melon maybe. And all of this stuff is there. There's a very definite undertone of peat, because, as I said, I mean, it's kind of a misconception to think that all of the Islay single malts are peated. This one is, and the peat is there, but I find it is more on the delicate side. It's a little bit more on the bright and lively, fruity side, but there's still that very definite base of peat. There's a hint of smoke, and I mean, as far as my nose is concerned, the smoke isn't overwhelming. This is more like a bright and sunny day with some bright and lively notes borne upon a salt breeze with a little bit of brine in there. The body is fairly robust. I mean, not as robust as the quarter cask that we looked at the last time, but you can sort of, it does linger there for a moment before it starts to streak and bead and run down a little bit. Now, the mouthfeel is fairly thin. It's maybe a little bit furry, and depending on kind of what terminology you prefer, you might say furry, you might say off, or you might say dry, which probably isn't the correct term to use in this case, as like I said, there are some fairly prevalent fruit notes there. So I'm gonna go ahead and say the ethanol punch isn't quite so overwhelming or aggressive, because like I said, this one clocks in at 46% alcohol by volume, so it's not that's going to get you. It's actually that that punch of citrus that hits me first when I get in there. So the mouthfeel isn't, it's not unpleasant, it's just a little bit on the thin side, which leaves you with more of a clean feel. It's not particularly viscous, it's not coating the entire inside of my mouth. But those fruit notes definitely take up most of the body, in this case with the citrus and with a little bit of melon, almost like a honeydew melon. But we would be remiss if we didn't mention the foundational peat notes. And although it's not obvious on the nosing, I can tell you from the tasting that that peat does bring with it a smidge of iodine, but it's not one of the most prevalent notes in this particular dram. There's certainly other whiskeys that we have already talked about and that we will talk about in the future where iodine is a big player, but that's not the case with Kilchoman Machir Bay. The finish is medium in length and it's got a peppery finish. And when I say peppery finish, I'm thinking actual peppercorns. And if you sort of take your time with it, and I believe that we had talked about this already, but oftentimes as you make your way through a dram, you shouldn't sort of resign yourself or consign yourself to your first impressions with your first sip, no matter how thorough that process might have been for you. I mean, you can take a lot of time, certainly by examining the color and by sniffing around in there, and then by sort of getting a feel for the palate and all those tasting notes. But I'm gonna suggest that it will change over repeated tastings. So kind of not a bad thing that I poured myself such a heavy dram, for sure. The only thing is actually, and while we're on the topic, the only thing I sort of want to mention is that I might be doing myself a little bit of a disservice in pouring such a heavy dram. And why is that? Because when you're dealing with a Copita glass or a Glencairn glass, you sort of want to hit the midpoint of this bulb, like the largest part of the glass. You want to hit the midpoint there to sort of maximize the surface area in which the whiskey can spread out and give off those aromas that are then funneled up towards your nose at the narrower end of the glass. So, I mean, is it a huge deal? At the end of the day, it's not for me. If you're sort of a real stickler for that sort of thing, it is something to keep in mind, which is why a lot of the times when you watch videos where tastings are occurring, they pour a fairly small amount into their glasses. I just couldn't help myself. I got kind of carried away because this is one of my favorite drams. So I wanted to sort of keep at it because I wanted to sort of re-examine that peppery finish. There's a little bit of sweetness there, and of course, sugar is a part of whiskey, whether you like it or not. We talked about sort of a little bit of the sweetness that came from the fruit notes that I had mentioned. The sweetness does linger a little bit, but it's very subservient to that those peppery tasting notes that you get on the finish. Finish itself is medium in length, but fairly clean. So I'm really excited to do some episodes in the future with whoever may be watching to do some food pairings, because that's where you take this whole experience to the next level. You can certainly get more out of your tasting notes and prolong this pleasurable ritual, I guess if you want to put it that way, by introducing food to the equation. But for now, I'm just gonna say that for a distillery that's relatively so young, again, having been opened in 2005, Kilchoman is doing it right. And on the next episode, I will feature another expression of theirs, but this one, Kilchoman Machir Bay, has a special place in my heart, certainly sits in one of my top threes, and it's a dram that you can enjoy pretty much any time of the year because it does have that lightness and that delicacy that's tends to lend itself better to warmer weather. But at the same time, it's got all of those things that we know and love from the Islay single malts. It's got the peat with just a hint of smoke, like I said, just a smidge of iodine to sort of let you know where it's from and what their roots are. So I hope you've enjoyed a pseudo history lesson along with the Scotch tasting for this evening. But for now, I will leave it there. Kilchoman Machir Bay is one of their core expressions. You should be able to pick it up at your favorite liquor store. If you get the opportunity, I highly recommend this one. I trust that it will become as special to you as it is to me. So until next time, when we continue our journey into the Kilchoman expressions, stay thirsty.